It is, as I like to say, Friday. And earlier this week, I got a note from somebody who said, Steve, check it out. The episode is up. The episode is up. And it's a podcast. And there's a podcast called 99% Invisible. And they put podcasts up. You can check this out. I'll put a link to the podcast in the description below this video. And it's called Rocket Man. And they called me actually quite a while ago. A producer called me and said, hey, Steve, we're doing a podcast on this show called 99% Invisible about jetpacks. Remember back in the day they said we're all going to have jetpacks? We were promised jetpacks. Well, we're going to do a podcast about that. Would you like to be in it? I said, I'd love to. Of course I'd love to. Now you might say, Steve, jetpacks? Oh yeah, it turns out I wrote a book called The Great American Jetpack. Now, before you get all excited and ask, can I buy a copy of that book? The answer is, I'm sorry, I can't help you with that because this book is out of print. It's a hardcover, but you'll notice it says my copy, so I don't accidentally give it away to somebody. And the book came out in 2013. So it is an older book. Book is so old. And the book's out of print now. And this is actually the only copy I've got, I believe. But what happened was, after I wrote the book about the Chrysler turbine car, my editor at this publisher said, Steve, you mentioned jetpacks in that book briefly. And I had, because the people from Chrysler who left that turbine car program, some of them went with a guy named Sam Williams to start a company called Williams Research that became Williams International. And they started developing really, really small jet engines. And one of the things they did with a small jet engine was they built a jetpack that actually had a small jet engine in it, which is pretty cool. And some other devices like the Wasp flying platform. And he said, would you like to write a book about that, jetpack technology? I said, I'd love to. So I wrote the book. They published it. It did okay, but again, it's 11 years ago. But it is out of print now. But I had a lot of fun writing the book and researching, and I got to interview a bunch of really cool people. And so apparently doing the research for their podcast on 99% Invisible, the producers came across my book and said, hey, we got to get this guy on our show. Now, here's the thing. I'm going to tell you right now, I spoke to them for about an hour. I think I got about 13 seconds of airtime. But I'm actually in there on a couple different occasions. But I'm going to tell you right now, the reason that I got bumped is they got some more important people involved. So, for instance, a man named Bill Suter was the guy who went around the world flying a Bell. They called it a rocket belt, but the Bell jetpack. And he appeared all over the place. He was one of the guys who did the stunt flying in Thunderball with the James Bond movie, where James Bond purportedly flies along with a jetpack. He also is the guy who flew into the opening ceremonies of the Olympics in Los Angeles in 1984. And so Bill Suter is still around, and he's got some fabulous stories. And I did speak to him also, but they spoke to him and used a lot more of his stuff. I'm going to let you know, though, in case you don't know, the rocket belt, the jetpack that you saw on Lost in Space, Thunderball, Gilligan's Island, all over the place in the 60s, was a thing that ran on hydrogen peroxide, and it would run for about 17 to 20 seconds, which literally meant that if you were up in the air for 8.5 seconds, you started looking for a place to touch down because you couldn't glide. You would fall. It was called lift degradation. That is what happens to you when you lose power with your jetpack. So what's amazing about the jetpacks, the rocket belts, all of these individual lift device things and the technology was most people didn't understand the limitations. They only knew what they were capable of. And if you saw one flying, a guy's up there flying around, and that's pretty cool. And in fact, the guy in the cover of my book is flying the Go Fast jetpack, which is owned by a company called Go Fast, and they use it to promote stuff. They get paid to show up places and do 20-second flights. 20 seconds. So it's a real interesting concept, and the whole history of it's fascinating. But it's interesting in that they were everywhere in the 60s and 70s and then just disappeared. But now with modern technology and small turbine engines, they are making jetpacks more practical. Whether or not we want to have people just buzzing around with them, I don't know about that. But the point is that in the podcast, 99% Invisible, they cover all of this. So the episode is 582. It's called Rocket Man. And on the website, it says in the 20th century, the jetpack became synonymous with the idea of a futuristic society. But of course, where did they go? So now they talk to me and they say, anything to give you an advantage in war is something your military wants. So people are thinking, hey, if we could strap rockets to soldiers who are running across the field and made them run faster, they'd be harder to shoot, says Steve Lehto, author of The Great American Jetpack. And so then, of course, they've got some great pictures here, too, about, various people flying these things. But again, the amazing thing about the jetpacks, they were cool. The rocket belts with the hydrogen peroxide and the 17-second flight time, they were really, really cool. But they only flew for 17 seconds, 18 seconds, And so the real thing about it was how much promise there was that was never fulfilled. And for instance, I can tell you that while they're trying to develop the idea of something that could just allow a person to fly, they were talking about all kinds of different things. And a company called Hiller made a thing called a flying platform, which was basically a big fan that pointed down. And you stood on top of it and you leaned to get it to go where you wanted it to go. And they call that kinesthetic control, the idea that there's a natural body movement that you can do to get something to do what you want it to do, like a Segway scooter, right? So they developed this Hiller flying platform and they trained guys to fly it. And Hiller was trying to get the military to buy these things. And so they would demonstrate them, and they would demonstrate them to the press, hoping that would drum up some support. They'd demonstrate it to the military, and the military is going, wait, let's get this straight. A guy's standing on this big flying platform. It's making a lot of noise. He's very visible because he's right there. What can he do up there? Can he fire a gun? Well, that's a problem with the jetpack is you can't because your hands are on the controls. So that goes out the window. How about observation? Maybe they can do reconnaissance. Well, the problem is, of course, the jetpack makes more of a racket than anything you've ever heard. Now, the flying platform wouldn't have been that loud, but interestingly, the flying platform took some work to learn how to use. But my favorite quote of all time, at least in this book, was when somebody from Hiller, the company that made the flying platform, was asked, how easy is it to fly? And he said, it's so easy, I could train a bear to fly it. As far as we know, no one ever did such a thing. One company built a thing that was actually just counter-rotating propellers. And you stood on a thing in the middle and controlled it with, hand grips. And of course, if you fell, you'd go through that thing like a Vegematic. That wouldn't have been very good. But later on, like I said, Williams actually built a jet engine about this big that would strap to your back, and a guy could fly that. And that had a longer flight time. But you were still limited by how much fuel you could carry. But that thing would fly for a matter of minutes as opposed to a matter of seconds. But once they developed that and demonstrated it to the press and to the military said, well, what can the guy do with that, though? Because he's up there in the thing making a lot of noise, and both of his hands are occupied. So there wasn't much you could do with it. So they built one of those. They also built the Williams aerial platform. The initials spell out WASP. And I've actually seen a couple of them. And that was a thing where they had a jet engine that you stood on top of, and it pointed straight down. And yeah, for the people in the audience who are thinking about this, you're straddling a jet engine. And then there was a housing around it. And because it supported itself when you're on the ground, you could put more fuel into it. And that thing could also fly for a better length of time, but again, used two hands to control. Now, they experimented with one where you could carry somebody else, so they'd have free hands. But them having free hands on a thing that was hard to fly with two people on it didn't quite go very far either. Again, really, really cool technology, a lot of promise, but it didn't go very far. So it's pretty cool. I got a lot of notes from people who said, Steve, strangest thing, I just heard you in a podcast talking about jetpacks. Didn't know you were an expert on such a thing. I'm not the world's expert on them, but I did, in fact, like I said, write a book about them. And I do know quite a bit about them. If you want to see an actual Bell rocket belt, there's one at the Smithsonian. There is one in a museum, it's a university in Buffalo that has one, because Bell at the time was near Buffalo, and that was they donated one to the local university. I've got a lot of photographs of that one also. And then there was a whole story about a couple guys who built a rocket belt and then got in a fight over it. There's a movie called Pretty Bird about that. Fascinating story, very, very strange. They don't know where that belt is today. It's a really, really weird story. But again, the fact that we were promised jetpacks, 1960s, 1970s. Here we are in the 2020s, and we still don't have them. But they could be coming, like I said, with modern technology. In fact, of all the people that I got to deal with while writing this book, Yves Rossi, the Swiss pilot, who has that thing he wears on his back, and now he usually drops out of airplanes, but he'll drop out of an airplane or a helicopter, and then he fires up these jet engines that are strapped to this wing on his back, and he can soar around up there. And he's done things like crossed the English Channel. He's actually gone and flown above the Grand Canyon. And the problem at that time is that he couldn't take off from the ground. He had to be dropped or air launched. So kind of cool. And a lot of interesting technology. The interesting thing I have to point out to you is that having written this book, when Yves Rossi flew over the Grand Canyon, Good Morning America contacted me. Said, do you know anything about jetpacks? I said, yeah, why do you ask? They said, well, we're doing a feature on Yves Rossi. He's about to fly his jet-powered wing over the Grand Canyon. Do you want to talk about that? And I said, sure. They sent a film crew to my house, and they set up this elaborate setup to get this footage of me. And they interviewed me for half an hour, 20 minutes. Now, I know this is Good Morning America. This segment's going to be 90 seconds long. If I'm lucky, I get 15 to 20 seconds. So I will admit to you that in a situation like that, I will often think to myself, what does the producer want from me? What could I say where they're going to go, that's so good, we have to use it. So they were asking me questions, and I'm answering into a camera, and there's lights all over the place and all this. I think I've got a screen grab of it, but I'll put that up on the screen if I can find it. And I'm doing this interview, and the interviewer says, what do you think it is about humans that makes us want to fly? Like, where does that come from? And I thought to myself, you know something, this is a softball. Bam. And I go, it's almost universal. You can go any place on this planet and find children out in a field running around with their arms out, pretending they're flying. And it doesn't matter what country you saw that in. You'd know what they were thinking, and you'd know, I did that too. It's, I think, universal. It's a human yearning. We'd like to fly. And we are on the ground, and we see birds flying, and we think to ourselves, I wish I could fly. And the interviewer turns to the cameraman and goes, did you get that? Did you get that? And the cameraman goes, of course I got that. And the interviewer goes, I want to have you say that again to make sure we got it. I'm thinking to myself, yes. So I said, you go to any country on earth, it's universal. Go find children playing in a field outdoors. And they're running around with their hands out like this, pretending they're flying. And it doesn't matter what country it is, we know what they're doing. It's universal. It's ingrained in us. It's instinctive. We want to fly. And the interviewer goes, oh my God, thank you so much. They didn't use it. And I knew somebody who worked at Good Morning America at that time. And I sent him a note. After I saw the piece, I go, thank you so much for thinking of me. Thank you so much for putting me on. I said, but you guys didn't use the one quote I thought you were going to use. And my friend goes, Steve, he goes, you got to understand, when we get like 32 seconds to put something on the air, we don't get 33. We get 32. We get 30. He goes, our time constraints are so precise that we routinely leave stuff on the proverbial cutting room floor that we wish we didn't have to. And he goes, sadly, there you are. And so that, of course, is a little behind the scenes action. But when I tell people, I say, hey, look, I've been on the CNN, I've been on the BBC, I've been on the Good Morning America. I get to add that to my resume, even though I believe my section on Good Morning America was about 12 seconds. So there you go. But again, yes, I was quoted on 99% Invisible. They actually have clips of me talking. It's an interview I gave them. It's a fabulous piece. Please listen to it if you get a chance. Otherwise, questions or comments, put them below. Let's talk to you later. Bye-bye.